I need to make love. Don't move or it'll hurt more. The cabin, nestled in the midst of untamed hills, stood like a quiet sentinel to the world Lila had hoped to escape. Surrounded by the wild forest, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a lone bird. Lila had come here to paint, to find the clarity she so desperately needed. The only thing she cared about now was the blank canvas before her, ready to be filled with the beauty of nature that seemed to pulse in the air around her. She had been painting for hours, her brush moving in fluid, deliberate strokes, capturing the quiet beauty of the world around her. But as she dipped her brush into another color, something shifted. The air grew heavier, a chill creeping into her bones that didn't belong to the still, sun-drenched afternoon. Her eyes flickered to the horizon, where dark clouds began to gather, fast and ominous, as if the sky itself had suddenly turned against her. She wasn't prepared for this. She had been so focused on her work, so lost in the rhythm of creating, that she hadn't noticed the storm brewing until it was almost too late. Her heart picked up its pace as the wind began to pick up speed, sweeping the grasses into frenzied waves. Lila stood quickly, her brush clattering against the easel, her fingers trembling with the sudden fear that washed over her. The storm was upon her, and there was no time to lose. But even in her panic, she couldn't help but notice the figure standing at the edge of the trees, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. Nathaniel. His gaze was steady, piercing, as if he had been watching her struggle for longer than she cared to admit. The man who had offered her refuge, yet kept his distance. He had warned her about the storms, and now, as they collided in fury, it seemed like the universe was aligning in ways Lila had not anticipated. As the first drop of rain splattered against her cheek, Lila hesitated, caught between the rush to pack her things and the undeniable pull that Nathaniel's quiet presence had on her. She had always prided herself on being independent, but this sudden, overwhelming need for someone else was unfamiliar and unsettling. With a sharp breath, she grabbed her canvas, shoving it into her bag as the wind whipped her hair around her face. But it wasn't enough. The storm was too fast, too violent. "Nathaniel," she breathed, as if the sound of his name would somehow make this all less real. Nathaniel appeared at her side, his movements fluid and sure, as if he had known she would need him. He reached for her, his strong hands guiding her toward him, and in that moment, Lila felt something deep inside her shift. She wasn't just scared of the storm anymore. No, it was something deeper. It was the storm within her, one that had been brewing for far longer than she had cared to admit. Nathaniel's hands were warm against her cold skin, but Lila's mind raced with 1,000 questions she had no answers for. She hadn't come here to confront her own vulnerability. She hadn't come here to need anyone. Yet here he was, standing so close, and suddenly it felt like everything she had been running from had caught up with her. This wasn't just about a storm. This was about everything she had hidden from for years, the pain, the fear, the raw need to be seen, to be held. As Nathaniel pulled her toward the cabin, the wind and rain howling behind them, Lila felt the overwhelming weight of what this meant, what it could mean. But even in the midst of the chaos, Lila knew she couldn't hide forever. As they reached the cabin, Nathaniel paused, glancing down at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside her. And for the first time in a long while, she was forced to confront the truth. If you believe that everyone deserves a chance to heal, to escape the chaos and find something real, then hit subscribe. Don't let the manipulators and the ones who prey on vulnerability comment. I stand for trust if you refuse to stay silent in a world that tries to silence the truth. Lila didn't know what was more disorienting, the storm that raged outside or the quiet intensity of Nathaniel beside her. The wind howled, rattling the windows, while the steady rain drummed against the roof like 1,000 frantic fingers. Yet inside the cabin, there was a stillness that felt both unsettling and oddly comforting. Nathaniel's hand was firm against her back as he guided her toward the hearth, his touch steady as the storm whipped around them. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls, and Lila couldn't shake the sensation that the warmth from the fire was nothing compared to the heat rising between them. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended, just the two of them, in the calm of the cabin with the storm swirling outside. "I'll take care of you," Nathaniel's deep voice rumbled, his eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. Lila's heart skipped a beat. It was simple, the words, but they hit her with the weight of a promise she didn't know if she was ready for. She had come here to escape, not to confront the very vulnerabilities she'd buried for so long. But now, standing in front of him, surrounded by the uncertainty of the night, it was hard to remember what she was escaping from anymore. The storm was no longer the only thing crashing against the walls. Inside her, something stirred. Something had shifted the moment she'd looked into Nathaniel's eyes, as if the storm outside wasn't the only force threatening to tear through her carefully constructed life. He helped her into a chair near the fire, his hands gentle as he eased her down. The pain in her ankle had dulled a little, but the ache in her chest was something she couldn't ignore. She tried to focus on the fire, but it was Nathaniel's presence that was commanding all her attention. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said softly, his gaze flickering to her soaked shirt and jeans. "You'll catch a cold." Lila opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was no suggestion, no hidden agenda. He was simply concerned, as if her comfort was the only thing that mattered to him in this strange, surreal moment. She hadn't expected this from him. She hadn't expected anything, really. "I'll get you something dry to wear," Nathaniel added, moving toward a chest of drawers by the corner of the room. He didn't ask, didn't push, just made the decision for her. Lila swallowed hard, unsure of how to feel about his sudden care. It was strange, disarming, and yet part of her welcomed it. As he rummaged through the chest, Lila sat back, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The fire was warm, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air, making her feel like she was in some ancient, forgotten corner of the world, far removed from everything that had once mattered. The storm outside seemed distant, irrelevant even, as she found herself focusing on the man who had brought her in from the rain. Nathaniel returned with a thick woolen sweater and a pair of soft sweatpants, setting them on the chair beside her. He didn't look at her as he did so, but Lila couldn't help but notice how his movements were precise, deliberate, like he knew exactly what needed to be done without a word being exchanged. Lila shifted uncomfortably. She had never been the type to let someone take care of her, let alone a near stranger. But here she was, sitting in his cabin, stripped of all her defenses and feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "I'll wait outside," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle but firm, giving her the space she needed. But the distance between them didn't feel like separation. It felt like an invitation to either retreat into her old self or step into the unknown. As he moved toward the door, Lila couldn't stop the question that slipped from her lips before she could think twice. "Why are you helping me?" The words came out quieter than she'd intended, and her heart thudded in her chest as if she were asking something much more personal, much more dangerous. Nathaniel paused at the door, looking back at her. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something soft, yet distant. He didn't answer her question directly, but the look he gave her spoke volumes. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe because you're here. And I can't just leave you out there in the storm." And with that, he stepped outside, leaving Lila alone with her racing thoughts. Lila sat there for a moment, staring at the fire, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Why had she even come here? She could have stayed in the city, stuck with her safe, predictable life. But something had driven her to this place, something deeper than her love for art or the need to escape. She had always been a solitary person, convinced that she didn't need anyone. Until now. Nathaniel had invaded her peace, but it wasn't in an unpleasant way. No, It was more like he'd stepped into her quiet world and disturbed the stillness just enough to make her realize how much she had been hiding from. And now, with him so close, with him taking care of her, she wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the storm outside or the storm inside herself. When Nathaniel returned, he didn't look at her, but Lila could see the way he hesitated. He placed the steaming cup of tea he'd brought her on the small table beside the chair. His gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary, but still he said nothing. Lila's heart beat faster, but she forced herself to break the silence. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice rough from the emotions she couldn't quite express. "For everything." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes flicking to the fire, avoiding her gaze. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, something deeper, but he remained silent. Instead, he sat in the chair opposite her, his presence filling the space between them. The cabin was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the steady fall of rain against the roof. The weight of their shared silence hung heavily in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply charged. Lila found herself wanting to know more about him. Who was Nathaniel, really? The quiet man who lived alone in a cabin, whose life seemed as solitary as her own. But she had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. People were unpredictable. People had their secrets, just like she had hers. But Nathaniel's presence, the way he didn't push, didn't demand anything, was a curious thing. It was as though he was waiting for her to make the first move, to open up. And for the first time in a long while, Lila wasn't sure if she wanted to keep running or face the truth staring back at her. The storm raged on outside, but in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension between them was no longer about the rain or the wind. It was about the unspoken connection that had begun to form, the one neither of them could ignore any longer. As Lila stared into the flames, a realization settled within her. Maybe she had come here for more than just peace and quiet. Maybe, just maybe, she had come here to face something she had spent years running from. As the night stretched on and the storm slowly passed, Lila knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving the next morning. Not yet. Not when so much was left unsaid. If you believe in standing up for the truth, no matter how difficult it might be, hit subscribe. Comment, "The city you are listening from the storm had finally passed," leaving a silence that felt heavier than the thrum of the rain. The only sound now was the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Nathaniel had built the fire high, and its warmth reached out to Lila, coaxing her muscles to relax, but it wasn't enough to settle her restless mind. She sat in the same chair where Nathaniel had helped her the night before. Her ankle was bandaged now, the swelling reduced, but the ache in her chest remained. The intensity of the night before lingered between them, though neither of them had spoken about it. He hadn't even looked her in the eye all morning, preferring to stay busy with his chores. The tension between them had thickened into something unspoken but undeniable. Lila found herself stealing glances at him when he wasn't looking. Every movement of his, every subtle shift, felt like a silent invitation to step closer to something neither of them had the words for. The reality of what had happened between them, what had almost happened, pressed against her, suffocating in its silence. Nathaniel was out by the barn when Lila finally decided she couldn't take the quiet any longer. She wasn't sure what she expected from him, or even what she wanted. She only knew that the more she stayed silent, the more the space between them seemed to stretch into an insurmountable chasm. She hobbled to the door, the soft thump of her feet on the wooden floor breaking the silence. She paused for a moment, staring at the rain-soaked world outside. The fresh scent of earth, of damp pine and wet stone, filled her lungs as she stepped onto the porch. Nathaniel's back was to her as he adjusted something in the barn. The sight of him, tall, powerful, and consumed by his work, stirred something deep inside Lila. She had never understood how someone could live so quietly, so isolated. She had always surrounded herself with noise, with movement, but Nathaniel, he seemed at home in the stillness, like the world itself was a constant that could be trusted. "Hey," she called out softly, her voice carrying more weight than she had intended. It was the first time she had said anything since the night before. He turned, his movements slow, deliberate. There was a guardedness in his eyes, a hint of something Lila couldn't quite read. "I didn't mean to wake you," Lila added quickly, as though her mere presence had been an intrusion. Nathaniel shook his head slightly, his eyes softening for just a moment. "You didn't," he replied, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice, as if he was struggling with something inside himself. Lila wanted to ask him what was going on, wanted to break through the walls he had carefully built around himself, but she stopped herself. There was something in the air between them that made her hesitate. She wasn't sure if it was fear or desire or something else entirely, but something held her back from pushing too hard. They stood there in the quiet, not quite together, but not apart either. Lila didn't know what to say next. Her mind raced, caught in the whirlwind of emotions she had no words for. She wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the distance between them, but she didn't know how to make sense of it all. For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't say anything. His gaze was intense, like he was weighing something. Then he spoke, his voice low, as though the words were difficult to force out. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the ground. Lila took a step forward, her heart racing. "Doing what?" He glanced up at her, but his eyes quickly darted away, focusing on something beyond her. "This. Helping you. Letting you in." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had expected many things from Nathaniel, but not this vulnerability that echoed the uncertainty she felt within herself. "I didn't ask you to help me," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tumult inside. "You didn't have to, but you did." Nathaniel gave a dry laugh, one that didn't sound amused at all. "Maybe that's the problem." His tone shifted, raw and edged with frustration. "I don't know how to stop once I've started." Lila frowned, trying to understand what he meant. "What do you mean?" His eyes finally met hers, and in them was something Lila wasn't prepared for, something raw and full of a longing she hadn't expected to see. "You don't need me," he said simply, as if it were a truth he had known for years. "And I'm not sure I need you either. But somewhere along the way, we started something we can't finish. And now it's too late to go back." The words hit her harder than she expected. A lump formed in her throat, and she had to swallow several times to keep herself from saying something she would regret. "You're wrong," she said, more forcefully than she had intended. "I don't think you understand what this is." Nathaniel's face hardened. "I don't. And that's the problem. I don't know how to handle this, how to handle you." For a moment, Lila couldn't speak. The storm had passed, but the tension between them was as fierce as ever. Her thoughts were a mess, and no matter how hard she tried to make sense of it all, the one thing she couldn't escape was the way Nathaniel made her feel, like she was seen, like she mattered in a way no one had ever made her feel before. Before she could respond, he turned away, his back to her as he returned to his work. "I'm not sure what to do now," he said quietly, not looking back at her. "But I know one thing. I can't keep doing this." Lila stayed where she was, staring after him. She couldn't quite process what had just happened, what had been said. But as she stood there, watching Nathaniel, something inside her began to shift. She had come here to find answers, to escape the noise of her life, but all she had found was a man who seemed just as lost as she was. It wasn't about figuring everything out. It was about learning to live with the questions. She had a choice to make now. Stay in this quiet, unknown place with Nathaniel, or walk away and go back to the life she had been running from. But something inside her, the same part that had made her take a chance on coming here in the first place, whispered that this was exactly where she needed to be. The storm may have passed, but for Lila, the real storm was only beginning. As the days wore on, and the silence between her and Nathaniel continued to stretch, she found herself standing at the edge of something she wasn't sure she could ever fully understand. What they had was delicate, fragile, but it was real, and no matter how much it scared her, she wasn't ready to let go just yet. The quiet of the cabin was oppressive, like a blanket pulled too tight. Lila sat by the fire, the only sound the occasional crackle from the flames. Nathaniel had stepped outside to tend to his sheep again, as he always did in the mornings. And the stillness that followed his departure seemed to echo in the space between them. Lila could still feel the weight of the conversation they'd had the day before. His words, spoken in the heat of the moment, haunted her. It was a truth she had expected him to ignore, a truth she had hoped to avoid, but Nathaniel had spoken it aloud. "I don't know how to stop once I've started." That raw, unguarded confession rattled her in a way nothing else had. For the first time, Lila felt truly alone in the cabin, and not just because Nathaniel was outside. It was the silence between them that had grown too heavy to ignore, the space that neither of them seemed willing to cross. She could almost hear the unspoken words swirling in the air, the things that neither of them wanted to say, but both felt. Lila stood up, her ankle still sore, though the swelling had gone down. She limped toward the window, her thoughts swirling as the morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the floor. She watched as Nathaniel moved across the meadow, his silhouette strong and purposeful against the backdrop of the storm-washed ski. The distance between them seemed to stretch further with every passing day. Why couldn't he just be open with her? Why couldn't he let his walls down, like she was trying to do? She had never been one for vulnerability, had never been comfortable with being the one in need. But something about Nathaniel's quiet strength drew her in, made her want to stay and unravel the mystery of him, even if it meant confronting things she wasn't ready to face. It was becoming clear that they were both holding something back. And Lila wasn't sure how long she could keep pretending it didn't matter. The desire for clarity burned inside her. What were they doing here, together in this strange, isolated place? The chemistry was undeniable. The moments when their gazes met, the way his touch lingered on her skin when he helped her, the gentle pull between them that had only grown stronger since that first night. But then there was his distance, his reluctance. It was as if every time she thought she understood him, he pulled away. Lila didn't know what to make of it. She wasn't used to being the one who had to chase answers. She was the one who had always kept her emotions in check, never allowing anyone too close. But Nathaniel was different. She wasn't sure if he was just being cautious or if he was hiding something from her, something important. She couldn't sit in this limbo any longer. Later that day, Lila found herself standing in the doorway, watching Nathaniel as he worked in the barn. His back was to her, his movements fluid, but there was something else in his posture. A stiffness, a wariness she hadn't noticed before. As much as he tried to maintain his composure, she could see it now. The cracks in his facade, the way he avoided looking at her when she came into the room, the way his hands would fidget if they were in close proximity. It was like he wanted to pull away but couldn't. Lila was just as unsure of herself as he was, but that didn't make her feel any less frustrated. She wanted to ask him, to demand the truth, but the words felt too heavy. She couldn't do this. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when she was drowning in questions. Taking a deep breath, Lila hobbled out the door, determined to break the silence that had been festering for too long. Her heart beat faster with every step she took toward him. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. He turned, his expression unreadable, though she could have sworn she saw the briefest flicker of something behind his eyes. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at her, the space between them once again charged with an unspoken tension. "I need to know what this is," Lila said, her voice quieter than she intended. "What are we doing here?" Nathaniel's shoulders tensed at her words, and for a moment Lila wondered if he was going to shut her down again, but instead he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know how to answer that," he said, his voice low. "I've spent my life alone, Lila. I'm not used to this connection. I don't know what it means, but it feels real." His admission hit her like a wave. The vulnerability in his words startled her. Nathaniel, the man who had been so careful, so controlled, was admitting something she hadn't expected. He was as unsure of this as she was. Lila blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "Then why won't you let yourself trust it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's face softened, but there was still a hesitation in his eyes, as if the answer he wanted to give was locked away somewhere deep inside him. "I can't afford to trust something I don't understand," he murmured, looking away. Lila's heart ached at the words. She had spent so much of her life avoiding the mess of human connection, afraid of being hurt, afraid of being vulnerable. But she had never expected Nathaniel to be just as afraid of it as she was. There was a long, painful silence between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved, but Lila realized something in that silence. They weren't so different after all. Both of them had spent their lives building walls around their hearts, and both of them were now standing on the edge, unsure whether to tear them down or let them remain. Nathaniel took a step closer, his gaze returning to hers. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt in his eyes. "I don't know how to do this, Lila, but I want to try. I'm just scared." Lila swallowed, her emotions tangled up inside her. It was the truth, the raw, uncomfortable truth. She had never been good at dealing with fear, her own or anyone else's. But there was something in Nathaniel's voice that made her want to reach out to him, to offer him the understanding he was craving. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, she understood. They weren't enemies. They weren't even strangers anymore. They were two people caught in the same storm, trying to find their way through it. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe they would stumble along the way, but they were here in this moment, trying. The silence between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a bridge, one that neither of them had crossed yet. But in that shared vulnerability, something new had begun to bloom. The storm had passed, but the real work, the real journey, was just beginning. The quiet after the storm was more unsettling than the chaos had been. The sun had begun to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the meadow. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the fresh, damp scent of earth and pine. It was a calmness that seemed almost unnatural, like the world had stopped breathing, waiting for something. Lila stood in the doorway of the cabin, her eyes scanning the landscape. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen, and for a moment she wondered if he had retreated into the isolation he seemed to crave. But something had shifted between them. The walls that had kept them apart were no longer as solid as they had been before. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She stepped outside, wincing slightly as her ankle twinged, and made her way to the edge of the woods. The storm had left the ground soft, and the air felt strangely heavy with the promise of something she couldn't name. She needed clarity. She needed to understand what was happening between them, what Nathaniel wanted, what she wanted. Lila wasn't used to being vulnerable. She wasn't used to needing anyone, much less a man who seemed just as closed off as she was. But when Nathaniel had spoken to her, really spoken to her, something had unlocked inside her. She had always told herself she didn't need anyone, that she could live her life alone, without depending on anyone else. But Nathaniel was different. He made her question everything she thought she knew about herself, and that terrified her. Nathaniel was kneeling in the dirt, his hands steady as he worked with the sheep, his movements precise and practiced. There was a quiet strength in the way he moved. But even from a distance, Lila could see the tension in his posture. He was always so calm, so controlled. But this, whatever this was between them, was a storm he wasn't sure how to weather. Lila hesitated at the edge of the field, unsure whether to approach him or let him be. She had wanted him to be open with her, to tell her what he was feeling. But now, as she watched him, she realized that he was just as afraid as she was, afraid of the unknown, afraid of the connection that seemed to be pulling them closer. She took a step forward, her heart pounding. "Nathaniel!" she called, her voice cutting through the silence. He turned, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Lila's heart skip a beat. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was something deeper, something raw and unspoken. "I've been thinking," Lila began, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt, "about what you said yesterday, about being scared." Nathaniel straightened, dusting his hands off as he walked toward her. "I didn't mean to put that on you," he said, his voice low. "I shouldn't have said that." "No," Lila interrupted, shaking her head. "It's okay. I get it. I'm scared too." He stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Scared of what?" "Of what happens next," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Of what happens between us. I don't know what this is, Nathaniel, but I feel something I can't ignore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lila could feel the tension building between them, but this time it didn't feel like a war. It felt like something they both needed to break through. Nathaniel's gaze softened, his expression vulnerable in a way Lila hadn't seen before. He reached out slowly, as if unsure whether to touch her, but then his fingers brushed against her arm, sending a shiver down her spine. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my life alone, and now I don't know how to let someone in, but when I'm with you, I feel something I can't ignore." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to open up like this, hadn't expected him to let down his guard. It felt like a revelation, like something had shifted in him, in them. "I'm not asking for much," Lila said, her voice trembling slightly. I need to know if we're moving forward or if we're stuck here." Nathaniel looked down at the ground, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "I don't know," he muttered, almost to himself. "I don't know what to do with this. With you." Lila stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "You're not alone in this. I'm just as lost as you are. But we don't have to figure it all out. Not right now. All I want is to know if you're willing to try." For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't say anything, but then, finally, he nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "I don't know where this is going, but I'm willing to try." The words hung between them, heavy and frail all at once. Lila could feel the weight of them, the promise they carried. This wasn't going to be easy. She knew that, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she wanted easy. She wanted real. Nathaniel stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He was so close now that Lila could feel the warmth of his body, could hear the steady beat of his heart. Without thinking, she reached up, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his cheek. The touch was soft, tentative, but it was enough. It was enough to tell him that she was here, with him, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, his breath catching at the contact. When he opened them again, there was no more distance between them. There was no more hesitation. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was gentle, almost questioning, as if he was still unsure of what was happening between them. But the moment their lips met, something shifted. The world outside the cabin disappeared. It was just the two of them, standing at the edge of something they couldn't quite understand, but willing to take the first step into it together. Lila's heart raced as the kiss deepened, the uncertainty of the past few days falling away. This was real. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. Later that evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Lila found herself sitting in the same chair by the fire, her thoughts tangled in the events of the day. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something important, but there was still so much she didn't understand. So much about Nathaniel, about herself, and about what they were building together. Nathaniel had gone to bed early, leaving her alone in the quiet of the cabin. The fire flickered in front of her, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But even the warmth of the flames couldn't settle the storm within her. What was she doing here? Was she really ready for this? Her mind replayed the moments of the day, the tenderness in Nathaniel's touch, the uncertainty in his words. He was just as scared as she was. They both were. But they had taken that first step together, and for the first time in a long while, Lila wasn't sure where the path would lead them. All she knew was that she wasn't ready to turn back. The night stretched on, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Lila sat there, caught between the past and the present, unsure of what the future held. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, she wasn't going to face it alone. The morning after the storm felt different. The air was still, crisp with the remnants of the night's rain. But there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the silence. Nathaniel had already left the cabin by the time Lila woke, as was his habit, and the quiet of the place made her feel like she had all the time in the world to think. But the thoughts circling in her mind were not easy. They were heavy, full of unanswered questions and emotions she wasn't sure how to handle. The kiss from the night before had been gentle, almost too cautious. It had sparked something between them, a connection that neither of them had been prepared for, but one they couldn't ignore. Lila's heart beat faster just thinking about it. She hadn't been kissed like that before. It hadn't been about passion or urgency. It had been about something more, something deeper that she didn't yet understand. She had been alone for so long, and Nathaniel's touch had been the first thing that felt real. But it terrified her. The cabin, with its quiet walls and flickering fire, felt like a cage she had built around herself. The more time she spent here, the more she felt that the boundaries between them were closing in, and the more she realized she had to confront the truth about what was happening between them. Nathaniel's absence was more noticeable than usual. She had expected him to return soon, to continue with his work, or perhaps to check in with her, but the hours passed with no sign of him. The knot in Lila's stomach tightened with every minute that ticked by. She was trying to ignore the way her thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the way he had kissed her, to the way he had looked at her, as if he was seeing her for the first time. But it wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that had led up to it. The distance, the moments when they had almost touched, the way he had kept pulling away when he wanted to come closer. There was something broken inside Nathaniel. Lila could feel it. And no matter how much she wanted to pull him in, to fix whatever was wrong, she couldn't help but wonder if he was just as afraid of losing control as she was. The storm had been a catalyst, but now that it had passed, Lila didn't know what was left between them. She had never been one to rely on someone else, never been one to need anyone. She had always been the strong one, the one who didn't let anyone get too close. But Nathaniel, he made her feel things she couldn't explain. By midday, Lila could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The silence between them had stretched too long, and the weight of unspoken words had become unbearable. She grabbed her coat and went outside, determined to find Nathaniel. If she didn't do something now, she knew she would never get the answers she was searching for. She walked across the meadow, the wet grass sticking to her shoes. Her ankles still ached from the fall, but the sharpness of the pain was nothing compared to the way her heart twisted with every step. She had to know what Nathaniel was thinking. She had to know if he was just as lost as she was, or if she was alone in this. When she reached the barn, she saw him working with the sheep, his back to her. The scene looked so familiar, so peaceful, but Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved with purpose, as if he were trying to outrun something. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice cutting through the silence. He turned, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze lingered on her for a beat longer than usual, but still there was something distant in his eyes. "I was looking for you," Lila said, her heart thudding in her chest. "We need to talk." Nathaniel's face hardened. "About what?" "About this," she said, her hand sweeping between them. "About us. About what happened last night." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I thought we didn't need to talk about it." But we do, Lila insisted, stepping closer to him. I don't understand, Nathaniel. We've been dancing around this for days, and last night, it was different. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, but I need to know if you're feeling the same way, or if I'm just imagining things. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment as if he were gathering his thoughts. Lila, he stopped himself, shaking his head. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to make you understand. I've lived my life on my own, and now you're here, making me feel things I'm not sure I can handle. Lila's pulse quickened. I'm not asking you to handle anything. I'm asking you to be honest with me. Are you scared of this? Of us? Nathaniel's silence was louder than any words could have been. His gaze dropped to the ground, his hands clenched at his sides. I'm not scared of you, he said softly. I'm scared of what happens if I let you in. I've been alone for so long, Lila. I don't know how to share this with someone else. The distance between them seemed to stretch even further now, and Lila felt the overwhelming weight of it, but this time she couldn't let it break them apart. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, her voice quieter but more determined. You're not alone anymore, she said, her hand gently brushing against his arm. We don't have to figure everything out right now, but we can't keep running from this. Nathaniel looked at her, his face conflicted. I don't want to hurt you. Lila's heart fluttered, but she refused to let fear stop her. I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel. Not unless you want me to. He hesitated, then looked into her eyes, the walls he had so carefully built beginning to crumble. I don't want you to go. And that was enough. The moment their eyes locked, the tension that had filled the space between them for so long seemed to dissolve. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't clean, but it was real. For the first time, they were both willing to step forward, to face what had been building between them for days. Nathaniel took a slow, hesitant step forward, closing the distance between them. When he reached her, he gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and tentative. I don't know what's going to happen, he whispered, but I want to try. With you. Lila felt her breath catch in her throat as she nodded, her fingers lightly touching his wrist. Me too. And in that moment, they crossed the line that had kept them apart. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. As they stood there, the world around them seemed to fall away. The storm within them had passed, but the calm that followed felt like a new beginning. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear. Just the two of them, standing at the edge of something they were both ready to embrace. Lila woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin's wooden blinds, casting delicate lines of warmth across the floor. The night had passed in a strange sort of peace, and as she opened her eyes, she realized the storm inside her had settled, leaving behind a quiet sense of clarity she hadn't expected. She was still in the same chair she had fallen asleep in, her blanket wrapped around her. But the sensation that lingered wasn't the cold of the night. It was a warmth, a subtle but undeniable comfort that seemed to come from the man asleep just a few feet away. Nathaniel had stayed by her side the entire night, his presence a constant reassurance she hadn't known she needed. He hadn't said much after their conversation the night before, but when they had settled beside the fire, there had been no more words necessary. It was in the way their hands had brushed together, in the quiet moments of just existing in the same space. Now, as the morning light broke through the gloom of the past few days, Lila couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was where she was meant to be. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, careful not to wake Nathaniel. He was still sleeping soundly, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen before. The lines of tension that usually furrowed his brow were gone, replaced by an almost childlike peace. His chest rose and fell steadily, and for a moment, Lila simply watched him, her heart full of thoughts she didn't quite know how to express. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the reality of their situation began to settle in. What had happened the night before, what had shifted between them, wasn't just a moment of passion or a fleeting desire. It was something deeper, something that was beginning to unravel the lives they had each built. Lila wasn't sure how to navigate this new territory. She wasn't used to feeling so exposed, so vulnerable. But with Nathaniel, something felt different. It was as if he had opened a door to a part of her she had kept locked for so long. He had told her he didn't know how to let anyone in, but Lila had never been good at letting people in either. She had spent her life protecting herself, keeping others at a distance. But with Nathaniel, there was no space between them, no room for pretense. It was raw, real, and terrifying. As she stood up, wincing slightly from the strain on her ankle, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She couldn't keep running from the truth of what was happening between them. If she wanted to truly understand what they were building together, she needed to confront her fears, and Nathaniel needed to do the same. Nathaniel stirred beside the fire, a soft groan escaping his lips as he stretched. His eyes fluttered open, and when they met Lila's, there was no hesitation this time. No more walls, no more guarded expressions. There was only raw honesty in his gaze, and something in his eyes made Lila's heart skip a beat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to say something, to break the silence that had stretched between them for so long. But this silence was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with the weight of unspoken words. It was easy. "Good morning," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with sleep, but still warm, as though he had been carrying a weight for years and had finally set it down. He sat up slowly, looking at her with a quiet intensity. Lila smiled, a soft, hesitant smile that didn't reach the corners of her eyes. "Morning," she replied, still unsure of what to say. Nathaniel shifted his weight, and for a brief moment the air between them felt charged again. He looked at her, his gaze softening, and then he spoke again, this time with a quiet sincerity. "I'm not used to this. With anyone. I don't know how to do it, Lila. How to let myself trust this." Lila's chest tightened. "You don't have to know everything right now. I don't either," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "But I know I'm not walking away from this. From you." Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something akin to relief, as though her words were the permission he had been waiting for, the key to unlocking whatever part of him had been too afraid to move forward. He ran a hand through his hair, still disheveled from sleep, and let out a breath. "I want to try," he said simply, his voice steady. "I want to try with you." Lila felt her heart flutter, the weight of his words settling over her like a soft, unexpected rain. It wasn't perfect. There was still so much left unsaid, so much left to figure out, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They were both willing to try, and that was enough. The next few hours passed in a blur of quiet moments. They worked together around the cabin, a rhythm beginning to form between them that felt natural, like they had been living in this space together for far longer than just a few days. Nathaniel had shown her how to chop wood properly, and she had helped him feed the sheep, each task an unspoken gesture of their growing partnership. But it wasn't the tasks that mattered. It was the way they moved in sync, the way their gazes would meet and linger, saying more than words could. The tension from before was still there, but it had shifted from something unspoken and awkward to something they were both actively embracing. Nathaniel had a way of making everything feel effortless, like nothing was out of reach, and with him, Lila found herself letting go of the barriers she had spent so long building around her heart. She had always told herself she didn't need anyone, that she was better off alone. But Nathaniel had slowly unraveled those truths. Maybe she didn't need him, but she wanted him, and that, for her, was a revelation. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting the world in a soft golden light, they sat together on the porch, the fire still crackling softly inside. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, as if they had finally found their place in this strange new world they had created. Lila had her head leaning against the back of the chair, her eyes closed as the last warmth of the day faded into the cool night air. Nathaniel was beside her, his arm resting on the arm of the chair, close but not touching. "Tell me about your life," Lila said suddenly, her voice a little quieter than she'd intended. Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. He didn't answer right away, but she could see him thinking, processing the request. She could feel the hesitation in him, his reluctance to share, but Lila didn't want to push. She just wanted to know him, not the guarded version, not the version he had shown to the world, but the real Nathaniel. "I've always been here," he began slowly, his voice low, "on this land. My family has lived here for generations. I take care of the farm, the sheep. It's all I've ever known." Lila nodded, her gaze on the distant hills. "You're happy with it?" Nathaniel's lips quirked into a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've never known anything else." Lila could hear the unspoken parts of that sentence, the things he hadn't said. "And if there's something else? Something beyond this?" Nathaniel paused. "I don't know if I'm ready for it." Lila sat with that thought for a long time, the silence between them carrying an understanding that was more profound than words could express. Neither of them had all the answers, but in this moment they had something better, a willingness to find those answers together. As the night settled in around them, Lila felt the weight of the future pressing against them, but for once it didn't feel so heavy. The morning after their quiet conversation felt like the calm before another storm, calm but full of unspoken tension. Nathaniel had already left for the fields when Lila woke, the pale light of dawn creeping through the windows. The fire was low, the soft crackle of embers the only sound in the cabin, and the air was cool and crisp. The day was beginning in the same slow, deliberate way it always did, but for Lila, everything felt different. It wasn't the weather, it wasn't the tasks of the day or the quiet rhythm of life on the land. It was Nathaniel, and the way he had let her into his world, even if it was only just a little. It was the things he hadn't said, the truths hidden beneath the surface that she could sense but couldn't fully grasp. Lila got up, the pain in her ankle barely noticeable now, and began preparing breakfast. The cabin was still too quiet, too empty without Nathaniel's presence. She realized that she had gotten used to the weight of his silence, to the steady hum of life that seemed to exist only in his world. But this was not her world. She wasn't sure if it ever could be, and yet she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. By the time Nathaniel returned from the barn, Lila had finished cooking and set the table. He stepped inside, his movements efficient as he hung his coat on a peg by the door. His face was guarded, as it always was after a long morning of work, and his eyes briefly flickered to her before he turned toward the stove. Lila watched him, the desire to ask questions bubbling in her chest. She could feel the walls he had built between them again. She had noticed it earlier, the way he had avoided her gaze, the way he seemed to be keeping himself in check, and though she had come to expect this from him, it still stung. "Nathaniel," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk about what happens next." He froze for a second, his back still to her. She watched his shoulders tense, his jaw tightening as though he had been bracing himself for this conversation. "I know," he said quietly, his voice rough. He turned slowly, looking at her now, but there was something in his gaze that wasn't quite right, something distant. "But I don't know if I can give you what you need, Lila." Lila's heart sank at his words, the familiar ache of abandonment creeping in. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to need him, not when she wasn't even sure what he was offering. But there it was, an undeniable truth that had been quietly eating at her from the inside out. She set the cup she was holding down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "You've already given me more than I ever expected, more than anyone has, and I don't—" She stopped herself, the words suddenly too much, too real. Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair as though he was trying to push the thoughts from his mind. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, but there was still an emotional gap that couldn't be bridged by proximity alone. "I don't know how to make this work, Lila," he said, his voice low and regretful. "I've spent so long being alone, being self-sufficient, that I've forgotten how to be anything else. I don't know how to build something with someone else. Not like this." Lila's chest tightened, and for a moment she just stared at him. He wasn't asking her to leave, but he wasn't offering a way forward either. He was stuck, caught between the life he knew and the one that was slowly pulling him in. "Is that all this is?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "Just fear. You're afraid of what this could mean, of what it might cost you. Because I'm not asking you to change everything. I'm not asking for perfection. I just want to know if you're willing to try." Nathaniel's eyes softened, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering between them for a moment before he took her hand in his. The touch was tentative, almost apologetic, but it felt like a promise. "I don't know what will happen next," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. I just need you to understand, I'm not good at this." Lila nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. "Neither am I," she admitted softly. "But I want to try too." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet wasn't painful. It was a space they could share, a space where they were both willing to be vulnerable with each other, even if it wasn't easy. Nathaniel didn't pull away from her touch, and Lila didn't try to force him to say more than he was ready to. They simply stood there, connected in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed too much to bear, Nathaniel let out a small, hesitant chuckle, his hand still resting over hers. "I guess we're both in over our heads, huh?" Lila smiled through her tears, the tension in her chest easing for the first time in what felt like forever. "It seems that way," she said with a light laugh. "But I think we can handle it. Together." Nathaniel gave her a look that was equal parts disbelief and hope. "Together," he repeated, his voice steady but full of something she couldn't quite define. "Yeah, I think we can." As they sat down to breakfast, the atmosphere between them had shifted. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. They were both committed to trying, to facing whatever came next, no matter how uncertain it might be. Lila could feel the walls Nathaniel had built around himself slowly starting to crumble. And though she knew they weren't ready to face everything just yet, she had the sense that they were moving in the right direction. But there was still so much to work through. So many things unsaid, so many emotions still tangled between them. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay, that the past didn't still hang over them, but for the first time, she felt like they were on the same side. And that, in itself, was a victory. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shared work and quiet conversations. They didn't talk much about what had happened or what would happen next. Instead, they let their actions speak for them. Nathaniel showed her more about life on the farm, teaching her how to mend fences and work with the animals. And Lila, for her part, did what she could to make their days easier, offering him the companionship he didn't realize he had been missing. As night fell and they sat on the porch again, looking out over the land, Lila couldn't help but wonder what would come next. There were still so many unknowns between them, but she didn't feel afraid anymore. Not the way she had before. For the first time, she was ready to face whatever came, because now she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. The night stretched on. The soft rustle of the trees outside the cabin, the only sound in the stillness. Lila leaned her head against Nathaniel's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. They had come so far in such a short time. And as they sat there together, she knew that the future was uncertain, but as long as they were together, it didn't matter. The days that followed were an odd blend of peace and uncertainty, each one passing with the quiet promise of something more. The storm inside Lila had passed, but the calm that followed wasn't without its own set of challenges. Nathaniel and Lila had started to build something together, a small, fragile foundation, but the cracks in their pasts were never far from their minds. The scars they both carried, the fears they both fought, were still there, lying beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But as the days wore on, they found a rhythm in their connection, a shared understanding that didn't require words. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. The mornings were filled with work, feeding the animals, mending the fence, and taking care of the cabin. They worked side by side, the task of the day grounding them in the present. Nathaniel's movements were still sure and purposeful, while Lila, though still somewhat clumsy with the farm work, found herself learning more and more each day. But the work was more than just a way to pass the time. It was a way for them to communicate without saying a word. Every time their hands brushed, every time their eyes met across the field, it felt like another step forward. Lila had never imagined she would be here, learning how to live off the land, struggling with the quiet simplicity of it all. But with Nathaniel, it felt right. She found herself waking up each day with a sense of purpose she had never known before. It wasn't the career she had once dreamed of, the life she had planned for herself, but it was a life she was beginning to find worth in. Nathaniel, for his part, seemed to be adjusting as well. The walls he had built around himself were slowly starting to come down, and while he wasn't as open as Lila would have liked, there were moments when he let his guard down. A small smile, a shared glance, a laugh. They weren't much, but they were signs that Nathaniel was allowing her in. But even as they settled into this new life together, something still nagged at Lila, the question that had been with her since the moment she arrived. What happens next? She didn't want to rush him. She didn't want to push him into something he wasn't ready for, but she had to know if this, whatever this was enough for him. If he was willing to stay in this moment with her, or if he would one day pull away again, retreating into the life he had known before her. One evening, as the last light of day faded behind the hills, Lila and Nathaniel sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cooler now, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth. The cabin, with its rustic charm, felt more like home each day, and for the first time in a long time, Lila didn't feel out of place. She rested her head on Nathaniel's shoulder, his arm draped casually over the back of her chair. The stillness between them was comfortable now, no longer fraught with the tension it had once carried. Lila could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, the quiet sound of his heartbeat, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax fully into the warmth of his presence. "I'm not used to this," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice almost lost in the sounds of the evening. He turned his head slightly to look at her. "I've spent so much time on my own, Lila. I didn't think I'd be able to share it." Lila smiled, turning her face slightly so that her cheek rested against his arm. "I know," she said softly. "I'm not used to it either, but we're here, together." Nathaniel nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Together." His voice was soft, but there was a sense of finality in it, as if he had finally accepted that this, whatever this was real. And it was enough. Lila sat up slightly, her hand reaching for his, her fingers gently curling around his. She didn't need him to say anything more. She didn't need him to have all the answers. They were here in this moment, and that was enough. The next few weeks passed in a similar fashion, each day blending into the next. They continued to work side by side, their relationship growing slowly but steadily. Lila found herself questioning less, trusting more, and with Nathaniel by her side, the future didn't seem as daunting as it had once been. One evening, as they finished dinner, Nathaniel turned to her, his expression serious but not closed off. "Lila, I've been thinking. I know we've both been hesitant about what happens next, but—" He hesitated for a moment, his words unsure but steady. "I don't know where this is going, but I'm willing to find out with you." Lila felt her chest tighten with emotion. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't sure what would come next, what challenges they would face, but she knew one thing: they would face it together. The storm they had weathered, both external and internal, had led them here, to this quiet place where they could begin again. "I don't have all the answers either," she replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." Nathaniel smiled then, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I don't want you to go." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet kind of joy. "Then we'll take it one day at a time." As they sat there together, watching the stars appear above them, Lila realized that the future wasn't something to be feared. It wasn't something to rush toward, either. It was something to be lived, one moment at a time, with someone who was willing to try as hard as she was. And that, she thought, was enough for now. The night stretched on, the soft rustle of the trees outside the cabin the only sound in the stillness. Lila leaned against Nathaniel, feeling the warmth of his body next to hers. They were here, together, and that was all that mattered. For once, she wasn't thinking about the future. She wasn't worried about what would come next. She was simply present in this moment with Nathaniel. And in that moment, she realized that no matter what came next, they had already taken the hardest step. They had chosen each other. If you believe that everyone deserves a chance to heal, to open up, and to find something real, hit subscribe now. Only those who aren't afraid to embrace love and vulnerability will. Comment, "I stand for trust," if you're with Lila and Nathaniel, choosing to step forward even when it's hard. The future might be uncertain, but together we can face it.